Route 10 was never a road for the faint-hearted. Twisting through shadowy pine forests, its curves seemed to mock the very idea of straight paths. The occasional flicker of a distant street lamp was all that kept the night at bay, and the cell service was practically non-existent. It was a place where truckers came and went, never knowing if they'd leave with the same sanity they arrived with. But the stretch near mile marker 213, that part of the road had a reputation. Hank Big Rig Malone had heard the stories, of course. He'd heard them from the veterans, from the newbies, from everyone in between. They said it was a girl, about 8 or 9, dressed in a tattered yellow dress. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, like they'd been drained of life. She'd appear at exactly 3:33 a.m., always in the same spot, standing under a flickering street lamp. If you saw her, that was the last thing you'd ever see. Truckers who'd followed her, some willingly, some against their will, had vanished, their rigs found abandoned, engines cold, drivers nowhere to be found. The legends were clear: don't follow the girl. Hank, though, was a man of logic. A seasoned veteran, he'd been on the road for over 30 years. He'd seen it all: accidents, bad weather, near misses with animals. He had his demons, guilt over missing his daughter's childhood, mostly, but he wasn't about to let a ghost story keep him awake at night. Ghosts aren't real, he'd tell the young drivers, shaking his head as they shivered at the mere thought of mile marker 213. But that was before the fog. It was a damp, foggy night in October when Hank rolled onto Route 10 at around 3 a.m. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the air was so cold it bit into his skin. The cab of his rig felt like an island in the middle of a vast, dark ocean. He was heading for the next truck stop, the one that always had decent coffee and a few truckers who were willing to talk about anything but the weather. As Hank's rig hummed along the twisting road, the radio crackled. Static filled the cab, making his fingers twitch toward the dial. He'd learned over the years to tune out the random bursts of noise. Sometimes it was just the wind, or the city's electrical grid, or maybe even the long stretches of road where the signal bounced around. But tonight it sounded different. It wasn't just static, it was something more. It was a whisper. "Help me." Hank stiffened. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, then to the road ahead. He told himself it was nothing, just some trick of the wind, or maybe a stray signal from another trucker. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure. A small, pale girl, standing under a flickering street lamp. Her hair was wild, her dress torn and stained with mud. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Hank as he slowed the rig. The temperature dropped in an instant. Hank could feel the chill seep into his bones, and his breath came in visible puffs. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What the hell?" Hank muttered to himself. The girl didn't blink. Her eyes, if you could even call them eyes, glowed faintly like the embers of a dying fire. The glow was cold, unsettling. It pierced through the fog, drawing him in, pulling him closer. His foot was already easing off the brake, and before he could stop himself, the rig swerved toward her. The wheel turned of its own accord, as if some unseen force was guiding him. He tried to fight it, tried to wrench his hands away, but the pull was undeniable. His eyes stayed locked on the girl, who was now staring directly at him, her hollow eyes pleading. The road ahead narrowed, the curves sharper, the trees more densely packed. Hank's foot slammed down on the brake, but the rig didn't respond. It was as if the road had a mind of its own. Then, in the midst of his panic, Hank felt it. A pressure against his chest, sharp and sudden. His hand instinctively reached for the source, a pendant, a small, weathered photograph of his daughter, Annie. The weight of the photo dug into his chest like a lifeline. The connection was instant. His daughter. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even spoken to her in months. But in that moment, he remembered. He remembered everything he'd missed. The road twisted into darkness, but the pendant seemed to anchor him, pulling him back from the edge. With a final, desperate wrench of the wheel, Hank broke free from the trance. The rig skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the wet road. The girl's wail pierced the night, high and shrill. "Why won't you help?" And then, just like that, she was gone. The fog swallowed her up, leaving Hank alone in the stillness of the road. The temperature began to rise, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Hank's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but the image of that girl lingered in his mind like a phantom. It took everything in him to move again. Hank slowly eased the rig to the shoulder and climbed out of the cab, his legs shaky beneath him. He didn't know what to expect, but his gut told him there was something he needed to do. His boots crunched against the wet gravel as he made his way to the street lamp where the girl had stood. There, behind an ancient oak, he found it, a small, sunken grave. The earth was disturbed, the dirt still soft. At the foot of the grave, partially buried in the leaves, lay a rotting teddy bear. Hank knelt beside it, his stomach churning. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, but when he stood up, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave this child to haunt this road forever. The next day, Hank spent hours under the oak, digging carefully, making sure to give the little girl the dignity she had been denied. He placed her ghost to rest, covering her in fresh earth and placing the teddy bear on top as a marker. It felt right, the weight of the act settling in his bones like a burden lifted. That night, Hank passed mile marker 213 again. This time, the street lamp was dark, and the air felt different, lighter, warmer. As he drove past, the CB crackled again. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple, quiet thank you. The legend of mile marker 213 began to fade after that night. Hank never saw the girl again. He'd made his peace, and the curse of the highway seemed to lift. He didn't know what had changed, if it was the girl's spirit finally finding rest, or something else entirely. But he did know this. The road was still there, winding through the dark. And though Hank wasn't a man to believe in ghosts, he found himself visiting truck stops along the road, telling the younger drivers about the girl who had once haunted the road. He shared his story, urging them to listen to the road, to pay attention to the whispers of the world around them. And sometimes, when the fog rolled in and the moon stayed hidden, Hank's daughter, Annie, would climb into his rig beside him. They'd drive together, talking, laughing, finding healing in each other's company. The years of guilt that had piled up between them seemed to melt away. The curse of mile marker 213 had lifted, but every once in a while, truckers who passed by would still nod toward the oak tree. Some swore they saw a flicker of light there, warm and golden, on the darkest nights, just as if the girl, now at peace, was watching over them. The Georgia night clung to Clay Dawson's rig like a shroud, the diesel engine's growl the only sound cutting through the humid stillness. He'd driven I-85 more times than he could count, hauling peaches and pecans from Charlotte to Mobile, but tonight the road felt like a stranger. The moon hung low and swollen, casting long shadows over the pine forests that crowded the roadside like silent sentinels. Clay cracked his window, letting the scent of damp earth and diesel mix uneasily. Somewhere in the distance, a whip-poor-will cried, its mournful call swallowed by the dark. He'd been driving since dawn, his eyes gritty from caffeine and the glare of taillights. The rig's cab was his second home, a clutter of gas station receipts, a faded photo of his daughter taped to the dash, and a well-thumbed copy of Huckleberry Finn wedged in the door pocket. Clay wasn't a superstitious man. At 52, he'd seen enough blown tires and midnight close calls to know danger was real, not some campfire story. But tonight, the air hummed with something he couldn't name. Somewhere past LaGrange, the radio began to spit static. He smacked the dashboard, cursing, when his headlights caught her. A woman stood at the edge of the asphalt, her floral dress glowing faintly in the dark, thumb outstretched. Clay's gut tightened. No car in sight, no bag, just her, barefoot and still as a tombstone. He blew past, eyes flicking to his rear view. She was gone. "Just tired," he muttered, knuckles white on the wheel. But 10 miles later, she reappeared, closer this time, her face pale as bone beneath a tangle of dark hair. The rig's engine sputtered. The temperature plummeted, his breath frosting the air. "Hell no," Clay growled, downshifting as the cab lights flickered. He'd heard stories, phantom hitchhikers, vengeful spirits, but Clay Dawson didn't believe in ghosts, just bad luck and bad coffee. Then she was inside. One moment the passenger seat was empty, the next she sat there, water dripping from her hair, the smell of swamp rot thick enough to choke him. Clay swerved, tires screeching, but the rig wouldn't slow. Her lips didn't move when she spoke. "Don't stop. They're waiting." Ahead, shadows pooled on the road, resolving into figures, men in overalls, their faces blurred, shovels in hand. The woman's hand gripped his arm, icy and solid. "Go, now!" Clay wrenched the wheel onto a dirt service road, the rig bouncing violently as the forest swallowed them. Branches clawed at the windshield, and the trailer fishtailed, nearly jackknifing. Behind them, the figures scattered like smoke. When he dared to look again, the woman was gone, a single magnolia blossom on the seat. Dawn found him at Maggie's pit stop in Opelika, a greasy spoon wedged between a pawn shop and a boarded-up motel. Clay hunched over a chipped formica table, nursing burnt coffee. His hands still shook. The waitress, a wiry woman with a name tag reading Dottie, eyed him as she refilled his mug. "You seen the ghost, ain't ya?" she said, nodding at the wilted blossom he'd laid beside his keys. Clay stiffened. "Ghost." Dottie leaned in, her voice low. "Lena Hargrove, drowned in the Chattahoochee back in '63, running from her husband's kin after he turned up dead. They say she's stuck warning folks about that stretch of road, same one where they buried her." She tapped the flower. "That's her mark. Means you listened." Clay stared at the blossom, its petals edged in brown. "Why me?" Dottie shrugged. "Ain't about you. It's about them, the ones who still linger there, looking for trouble." She slid a plate of grits across the table. "Eat. You look like you've seen death itself." That night, Clay hung the magnolia from his rear view. The roads felt quieter after that, the dark less heavy. He started leaving wildflowers at lonely crossroads, daisies in Alabama, goldenrod in Mississippi, whistling old Hank Williams tunes as he drove. Other truckers noticed. At first, they ribbed him. "Dawson's gone soft." But when stories trickled in of near misses avoided and eerie figures fading at the edge of headlights, the jokes turned to quiet nods. One frosty November evening, a rookie driver named Marisol cornered him at a Tennessee way station. "Heard you're the one who met Lena," she said, her voice trembling. "Last week, outside Macon, I swear I saw her. Then my brakes failed. But there was this light." Clay handed her a sprig of lavender from his glove box. "Put this on your dash, and keep your eyes open." Years passed. The haunting on Highway 85 faded, as if Lena finally heard, found peace in guiding others home. Clay retired his rig at 65, but the tradition lived on. Drivers still leave flowers now tucked into grills tied to antennas, and swap stories at dusty truck stops. Some say the highway watches. Clay just smiles. On quiet nights, when the moon hangs low and the pines sigh, he swears he catches a glimpse of a floral dress in the rear view. No fear, no chill, just a whisper of magnolia on the wind. He knows it's not the road, it's the ones who walk it. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they walk with you.